In this live panel session with the London Stock Exchange, we explore a question many IR teams are asking. Does the market truly understand your business?
Hello and welcome to Spark Insights. I'm James Devon from the Issuer Services team here at London Stock Exchange. And today we're going to be discussing if the market really understands your business and how IR teams can evolve beyond disclosure first thinking and towards communication that reflects how investors consume information. Joining me today for this session are three leading voices from our Issuer Services marketplace community. We have Andrew Craissati, founder at Auddy, Alex Steller, Managing Director at InvestorHub, and Karen Almeida, Head of Advisory at Conran Design. A very warm welcome to you all. Thank you so much for giving up your time to speak with me today. So I'll give our panelists the opportunity to introduce themselves, their companies, and the work that they do there in a bit more detail later on. But before we do that, let me just cover a few housekeeping points. This session is being recorded. So anyone who wants to watch this again or share with any colleagues at a later date can do so by revisiting Spark Insights, where this webinar will live on as a video on demand. It's also designed to be an interactive session, so we do encourage you to ask questions using the functionality built into the platform. And you should be able to see the Ask a Question option on the right-hand side of the video player on your screen, but you can also ask questions live, and you can also ask live subscribe. But also, thanks so much for those of you that have submitted questions in the build-up to this event at the point of registration. We really do appreciate it. It helps us craft. It sort of helps us craft the story, and at the end of the day, this session is designed for our audience, and of course we want to make sure that the questions that matter to you are answered. So look, without further ado, let's move on to our first question. And panelists, as I asked before you answer, perhaps you'd like to introduce yourself, your company, and the work that you do there. So Alex, first question to you. When we look at how companies communicate with investors today, say compared to 5 years ago, what would you say is the biggest shift that you've noticed?
Perfect. Thank you, James. And thank you again to the LSE for putting on these fantastic conversations and for continuing to invite me. So before I get to that quick introduction, I'm Alex Steller. I'm the Managing Director at InvestorHub. We are a software business that allows PLCs and indeed public companies around the world to form direct relationships with investors. There's sort of three really important parts to what we do. The first part is disintermediation. We allow companies to do all of this without using third parties. Second part is shareholder intelligence. You need to have the data and the visibility over who your investors are to be able to communicate with them directly. And then thirdly, what do you do with all of that data and how do you turn it into actionable insights? And so hopefully across the markets we work in and the work we do here, there's some insights and value there that I can bring to the discussion today. And so, yeah, how has communication changed with investors today versus 5 years ago? I mean, a lot has changed, but I think that the number one thing that we have noticed is a change in what we call the IR triangle, the trade-off triangle. So there are sort of three key things that at any given point you are deciding between as an IRO or indeed as a company communicating. And that is, do you focus on distribution, frequency, or impact? And quite often you can only pick two. 5 years ago, most companies were picking distribution and frequency. So how do you reach as many investors as possible? The key battleground was distribution. It was hard to reach people. You had to pay for a lot of advertising, get as much research coverage as possible, et cetera, et cetera. That has now changed. The key battlegrounds now, as we see them, are frequency and impact. It's not that hard to reach people. If you give any marketing team a couple of £100, they could probably structure a targeted LinkedIn campaign to reach just about anyone. And so it is now really about how do you get very targeted and not spray your message out there, but focus on getting it to the right people in a very impactful way. And that sort of leads to the second big change, which is on the type of communication. Long form content used to be heavily favored by public markets. And so long research reports, long annual reports, which we might talk about later, it is now all about short form content. the average, I saw this very alarming study the other week. The average attention span for an adult, not just a young person, is now measured in seconds, and it's 3 seconds, which is crazy. And what that tells me, and what that should tell us, is that when we're communicating with investors, we need to be thinking much shorter, because very few people, I think, are going to sit through a sort of 50-minute presentation, other than something as engaging as this, or read a very long annual report. So it is just a big change in where the focus is and how you communicate.
Alex, thanks so much. Andrew, let me just turn to you. So we're talking about how companies communicate with investors today compared to 5 years ago. You would have seen through your work at Auddy some significant changes with the working day becoming more fragmented and mobile. Let me hand over to you.
Thank you, James. Thank you for inviting me. It's lovely to be here on this rather wet, rainy afternoon. So quick word of introduction about Auddy. We are a British company. Our clients use us to create content and to distribute content. That content is predominantly in the form of an audio podcast. And we have transformed the way that podcasts are delivered. We use both traditional public means of distribution through companies like Spotify and Apple Podcasts, but we also own and operate an encrypted private distribution platform for podcasts, and through which we are then able to measure the exact and precise impact that the content is having on each individual listener, so that we can inform our clients on all relevant insights as to the consumption of the content. I think your first question is a fascinating one. I think there is a noticeable transition that's taken place over the years. I think the first thing you have to remind yourself is that the investment community itself is significantly different. The retail investor is far more important today than they were those years ago, where they were considered a second-hand thought, a secondary buyer. Now, with entrepreneurs like Elon Musk, who are advocating almost exclusively retail strategies, that retail persona is now a very important person that has to be addressed. The behavior of the investor is also extremely different. Traditionally, in the old days, an institutional investor was consuming content in the workplace, at their desk. They were setting aside time to read documents, to evaluate and run their models. Today, they want that content to come to them wherever they are, whatever time of day it may be. So now they're on the go, they're in the gym, they're driving their car, they're walking the dog. So the consumption of content, as Alex very rightly alluded, is now in a much shorter form than it was previously. But it also needs to be delivered in a mechanism that is entirely flexible, so that it meets the needs of the investor wherever they are and whenever they are and with whatever device.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, I totally agree. Alex, let me turn back to you before we hear from Karen. So, in your experience working with London listed companies, would you say that the traditional results day and annual report model is still fit for purpose? Let's answer that question, but then let's talk about high impact investor communication and what does that actually look like in practice, Alex, and then we'll turn to you, Karen.
Yeah, I mean, I think to Andrew's point, the demographic of investors has changed. And so the way that they need to be reached and communicated with should also change. And the results day and annual report model was probably built in a very different time. My expertise is more on the retail side, so I won't speak to the institutional side. But on the retail side, I mean, to Andrew's point, the average investor now that is part of that cohort is consuming things on the move. And so a 150-page annual report is probably not the best way to capture their attention and deliver information. And so I think that if an annual report is still being used as a marketing document, then I do not think that is fit for purpose for that audience. And you might say, well, that's great, but what do you do instead? What does the high impact version of that look like? This differs company to company, but I think it is about identifying and measuring what aspects of that annual report are marketing material and are going to be consumed by, say, your retail investors, extracting that out, and then perhaps you're using Andrew's platform and communicating elements of that through short audio. Perhaps you're doing it through video, perhaps you're doing it in person, but extracting it out, making it more digestible, and spreading it over a longer time frame as well. I mean, to the results day part of that question, if we assume that most investors are working, they're probably not going to be available during the week at 2 p.m. to attend a webinar or to attend an in-person results day. So let's meet them where they are. Let's create something that can be consumed asynchronously and does not rely on them being in the city of London, able to sacrifice an entire day to hear the content.
Thanks very much, Alex. Karen Almeida, Conran Design. Let's bring you in. Your thoughts on high impact investor communication.
Thanks, James. Well, just to sort of set the context a little bit, Conran Design Group is a design and communications agency, and we work with a lot of large listed companies to develop and produce their annual reports. So probably won't surprise you to hear that I think actually there is still a role for the annual report. And part of that is because what the annual report is a single source of truth for the year for the company. And whilst I absolutely agree with Andrew and Alex that there is almost nobody, probably apart from the proofreader, the company secretary, and me and the auditors, who's going to read the whole report cover to cover, all 200 odd pages of it. But what it is a process that allows the important messages, the important data, and the supporting narrative to be developed in a way that is scrutinized, verified, and audited, so that what you have is that record, that single source of truth. And then once you have that, that's your repository. By all means, you can take that content, you can take those messages, and you can choose to share them in short form, bite size, through different channels at different times throughout the year. But it is the process of preparing, verifying, and finalizing that information that holds the value in terms of that investor story.
Thanks, Karen. Andrew, high impact investor communication.
Karen is right. I mean, the annual report is effectively the core narrative that the company is relying upon. I think the thing that you do have to remember, though, that the act of providing information with the traditional templates is a debate of compliance versus understanding. What is the purpose of the information that you're sharing? And how much is it being informed by your compliance officer or your general counsel, as opposed to really building a very deep understanding on the part of the investor, who is trying to grapple with not just the financial information that they're seeing, but also the contextual elements of what exactly is this company? What does it really do? Why is it successful? What do its customers think of it, etc. I think the other thing that's important to remember is I think there is a growing trend to move from quarterly information to more consistent, more frequent flow of information. We have quite a few clients who are large institutional firms. You would think they would feel very self-confident, but in fact, they have a certain degree of, shall we say, competitive anxiety as to whether or not their investors are thinking about them frequently enough and keeping them foremost in their minds. So what we've seen a really big shift in is the frequency in the supply of information, and trying to build much more context and nuance around that storytelling so that people really get a full three-dimensional understanding.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, totally agree. Karen, let me just turn back to you quickly. You obviously helped companies convey their key messages through annual reports and otherwise, I'm sure, as well. But what do you think is the best way to get investors to really focus on a company's key messages? You can't control these things, and investors will go for the information they want. But what tactics can a company use to make sure they draw investors to the messages they want them to see?
I think it's about three things. It's about being really clear. It's about being pretty concise. To Alex's point about short attention spans, you just need to think about what you need to say and how you're going to say it in a focused way. And you need to be consistent, because actually humans obviously are a very important audience for this content. But equally now, we know investors of all stripes are using AI tools. And we also know that AI doesn't always do a perfect job of extrapolating information. The point about being really concise, really clear, and really consistent is that actually what that does is it improves the likelihood that all your audiences, whether they're AI or human, will get those messages, will remember those messages. And that consistency is about reporting back on what you're talking about. So your key messages about your business, about the opportunities, about performance, if you have that consistency and that clarity, essentially what you're doing is refreshing, updating, building your track record, and just landing those probably 4 or 5 key things you really need investors to remember about your business, so that it's just a nice repetitive drumbeat that is coming back. You don't want to be dotting around here, there, and everywhere all the time. You want to be refreshing, but with that steady drumbeat that builds that consistency and that trust.
Thanks, Karen. Alex, drawing investors' attention to your key messages.
Yeah, I really agree with Andrew's point there that I think was very well made, that context is really important. And to add a point on why I think it's important, if you go back 10 or 15 years, let's focus on retail. Most retail or individual investors would be trading under advice. And so they might call up their broker and say, hey, I've heard about this fantastic company. I saw this RNS announcement or their lovely annual report, but I have a couple of questions. And then the advisor would sort of clarify that. Most investors are now self-directed. And so they're not getting that context from another source. And so it's now, for better or for worse, incumbent on the company to provide that and ensure that people don't, say, take the annual report and end up departing from the core message because they don't get it. And so I think the context is really helpful. And then an extra point would just be ensuring that it's delivered directly. And this is something that we can borrow from the world of consumer marketing. The direction of travel there for a very long time has been, as a vendor, and in this case, the public company is the vendor of their shares, how do you own the relationship? How do you get their contact details so that you can get your message straight to them and it doesn't have to go through someone else, which is where you can get confusion because it gets diluted along the way. So I think I agree with Andrew's point that frequency and context, but also just make sure you are the primary communicator, because otherwise you risk dilution and you just generally lose control.
Good stuff, Alex. Thank you. Karen, can I just turn to you and just ask a quick question about IR storytelling? Why is good storytelling essential in IR? And what should good storytelling look like?
The storytelling, I think everybody knows that investors will be focused on the numbers, but storytelling is what connects those numbers. It's the thing that gives them that context that Andrew and Alex have talked about. It's the thing that makes them memorable. So, when you listen to experts talk about how you can improve your memory, they will often talk about how you need to link things together in your mind. So it'll be, the red cup on the table next to the book with a picture of the zebra on the front cover. And by doing that, by having that chain, that sequence, that's the thing that allows you to build that picture and start to then put the context around that, which is useful. And that narrative just lets you develop that continuum, get investors to picture where you are, where you fit into your competitive landscape, what products and services you're offering, and understand how that story is evolving, what the dynamics are externally and internally that are helping that story to evolve. Not always through choice, but it's just about understanding that what that bigger picture is and where you sit within that.
Thanks, Karen. Turning to you, Andrew, Auddy no doubt help plenty of companies tell their story through the power of podcasts. What does good storytelling look like?
Well, let's be clear. storytelling is at the core of being a human being. When you are going on your first date, when you are negotiating a contract, when you are trying to pitch an institutional investor on why to invest in your public company, you are engaged in storytelling. The question is, how well are you doing it? In terms of creating the impact with storytelling, it's absolutely critical that you do it well. If you think about an institutional fund manager, he or she is going to be having a substantial conversation about an average 12 companies a day. That's not necessarily 12 meetings, but he is thinking about at least 12 companies a day. And at the end of the day, when he or she goes home, you have to try and compete to be the company that is still in their memory when they are on the tube going home that night. So you are in a highly competitive environment and you're trying to grab the attention of your audience. What makes storytelling compelling is that you are trying, firstly, negatively, to reduce the amount of misinterpretation around your business. So clarity, making sure the audience understands exactly what you do, why you do it, what problem you might be solving, why you're profitable, etc. So that's very important. The key thing, I think, for us that we see a lot is that good IR storytelling is really grounded in the facts. And I think Karen is right in emphasizing the importance of building that core narrative. But it is then trying to build a story about it so that it becomes memorable and clear and accurate in the minds of the investor, whether they are institutional or retail. And it's worth noting the retail investor, depending on where they are in the world, they're often on some sort of social media platform engaging in their research, right? I mean, in the United States, Reddit is the #1 forum for stock picking. So if you're not in the right ecosystem, building the right narrative, you are missing out where all of the decision making is taking place.
Thanks, Andrew. We've been going 22 minutes, so we're making good progress. Very quickly, Karen, and maybe Alex as well. I think we might have covered this in our previous question, but just briefly, what's the biggest challenge companies face when trying to tell their story clearly? What's inhibiting their ability to do that?
I think often the biggest challenge is that management teams and IR teams and comms teams are too close to the story. They're too embedded in it and they are too mired in the complexity of it all. And it makes it difficult for them to step back and essentially have a really clear-eyed view of what's going on in the business and where they really need to focus investor attention. And I think for that, sometimes it can be helpful to have an external pair of eyes, whether that's your brokers, your external advisors, your PR advisors, whoever, but just to help you understand with an external perspective what it is that people need to know about your story.
Very good. And Alex?
No, I really agree with that point. My answer is going to be very similar and say I think the curse of knowledge is the biggest challenge. And by that, I mean, actually, before this, I was at lunch with the chair of a biotech company, and the issue they have at the moment, is that the founder CEO, who is a scientist, is very close to Karen's point, very close to the science, to the data, and they find it very difficult to get them to reduce the pitch and the slide deck down from 45 pages because the scientists are so excited about all of the data, and they say, well, we must have all of this so that investors get it as well. And they sort of struggle to hear the feedback that not everyone has the same qualifications and background as you, and not everyone knows the story as well as you do. And so it's not dumbing it down to reduce it to a point that someone who doesn't have that scientific or technical background can understand. And so I think that the curse of knowledge, quite often you as the company know the story better than anyone else. And that means that when you prepare something, you have a lot of assumed knowledge that the average listener, whether it's retail or institutional, probably doesn't have. And to Karen's point, a great way to sense check for that is to ask someone external.
Alex, great answer. You and I have talked about this in the past about the work that investor relations teams and marketing teams would do together. Let's talk. How should IR and marketing teams work together? How should they work together?
Yeah, it's a great. We have talked about this before. I mean, I think that investor relations is becoming more like marketing, and in years to come, an investor relations function will closely resemble a marketing function. And so, in that interim period, how can you work together? One, going back to Andrew's very good point about giving investors context, your marketing team probably already produces a lot of great context about the business. The sort of information that goes out to your suppliers or your customers or your employees is exactly the same context that investors want. And so you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You can quite easily repurpose some of that and bring it across to your IR channels. And then the second point would be marketing functions generally have great access to data and are very good at using those tools to measure the efficacy of campaigns that they run. Now, that has traditionally been one of the hardest parts of IR. Very difficult to measure the ROI of anything other than sort of looking at the share price, which is a bit of a coincident indicator. And so I think there is a lot we can learn from marketing functions that have very sophisticated ways of measuring, say, and this might be something Andrew's tool does, put out a podcast, how many people looked at it, what did they think, how can we use that data to inform the next bit of content rather than just sticking to the static plan we have every year, because it needs to be a living, breathing, evolving thing. And that feedback loop using data is something that marketing teams are generally pretty good at.
Yeah, no, totally agree. Karen, your views on investor relations teams working alongside marketing teams?
I think what's really important is that at the start of the year, at the start of a big project, everybody sits down together and works out what their ambition is for the year, what the key messages are for the year, what the underpinning data is going to be, and just thinks about the message framework that they want to be sharing and communicating. It's back to that consistency point. And there are different audiences, and you're going to dial things up and you're going to dial things down. But in order not to be saying one thing over here and something slightly different over there, just understanding how you are going to have a hymn sheet, which is fundamentally consistent, is really, really important.
Yeah, no, totally agreed. Okay, Andrew, let's turn to you. Which voices and nuance investors can't get from the numbers alone? And how do employees or customers have a role here? Just on mute there, Andrew.
Sorry. Thanks for the question. It is important to remember that it's primarily the role of leadership to deliver the core messaging. There is a role for the employee to communicate, for the customers to communicate, also actually for independent experts who can validate the narrative of the company. That is also an interesting aspect. We have a client that is very involved in the connection between AI and healthcare. And a lot of how they communicate is by the use of Professor so-and-so, who will then validate their theories. I would never underestimate the importance of seeing a happy employee who says, I love my job, I love working here. It's a valid message that resonates with people. Employees can also give you context on more subtle aspects of a company, such as its culture and its values. And increasingly, obviously, there are investors who think about those perhaps more niche areas of investment decision-making. We do have clients who use the customers quite a lot. They have to go through a compliance process, but that's largely just a case of looking at the content that has been recorded and then understanding whether any of that content is not fit for purpose. But increasingly, that's becoming a very important way of validating the company's message.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Agreed. Karen, turning to you. which other voices out there will investors be listening to?
It's quite interesting. When we've asked investors this question, what they often say is that it can be useful to hear from customers to understand what problems that companies' products and services are solving for them and how they're doing that in a way that's differentiating from other suppliers, let's say. It's just really helping to learn that point about competitive advantage, about differentiation. And I think in terms of the employees piece, what's interesting, and I think Andrew's absolutely right, is it's all about culture. So, for example, we work with Bunzl, who are a very acquisitive business, and they have, I think, acquired about 70 businesses in the last 5 years. So it's very much part of their business model. But for them, one of the audiences for the annual report is companies that they are looking at acquiring, because actually what that gives is a really a strong sense, as you look through the report, of what it's like to be an employee in the business and to have been part of a company that was previously acquired. It's just that it's adding that bit of color and context around the decision-making process for those companies that are looking to be acquired, but also sort of indirectly how that contributes to the investment case, because that acquisitions model is very much what the business runs on. So to be able to do it well and have good retention amongst employees of companies that are coming in, to be able to demonstrate that is quite an important message.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you very much, Karen. Andrew, let me turn to you. How can issuers share essential context without sort of increasing disclosure risk, given investors often skip straight to the financials? But then I guess also, panel, within this question, let's also talk about how company leaders can think about being more visible on LinkedIn or social media. So let's start with Andrew.
When we talk to our clients, we work with them to frame the word context as meaning education, not disclosure. So the traditional statutory process of putting information into the market should remain unchanged, and you do what you do, driven by how the market operates. Context comes immediately afterwards. There are sequencing and timing issues to that, but context is therefore really about building the case for how your audience should interpret the information that is being presented to them and understanding the information that is being presented to them, rather than any effort to try and replace that traditional flow of information. So that's how we work around the concept of context.
Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. Alex, let me turn to you.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We have a similar saying internally, Andrew, but instead of education, not disclosure, we say signpost, not disclosure. But then it's to try assuage the concern that companies often have apropos posting more on social media or really doing anything other than a regulatory announcement. And it's sort of saying there is this fear that you have to say new information to talk to the market. That is not true. That's not true at all. You can signpost existing, already disclosed information. You can repackage it. You can offer context, but there are all these things you can do that do not require you to make a new disclosure. And so I think that's a brilliant point. And then on social media, specifically the role that that leaders have in sort of managing and developing their own social media, it's really important. 50 years ago, I think if we were to do a straw poll of the average sort of adult, they would probably not be able to name many CEOs. They probably wouldn't be able to name the CEOs of any FTSE 100 company or S&P 500 company. But you fast forward to today, and CEOs are like rock stars. They're known. People know Elon Musk. People know the tech CEOs. They know the big CEOs here. Like they're much bigger public figures. And authenticity from individuals is something that people really look for. So look, whether you like it or not, if you run a public company, you are a public figure. And you're sort of only doing yourself a disservice by not leaning into that. And how do you do that in a way that isn't scary? well, you don't need to be coming up with hot takes or new information in every post. As an example, there's a VC that I follow, so slightly different space, but I think a good example. And he's not posting articles or posts about the industry or companies investing in. His sort of thing is that every time he goes and visits a new company, he asks them for some of their merch, and specifically a t-shirt, because a lot of tech companies produce their own branded t-shirts. And he posts a picture of him in their t-shirt. And then he posts another picture of his walk-in closet where he's got 300 t-shirts from all the companies he's visited. And that's just a little quirky thing that he's come up with, but it's interesting content. It shows that he's out there and doing things and there's momentum. And so what I'm trying to say there is it's important to just try find your own voice. It doesn't really matter what you post about. It's just showing people that you're there and really, helping them to understand that you are actually doing things.
Yeah. No, you agreed, Alex. Karen, over to you. Your thoughts on how should company leaders think about becoming more visible on LinkedIn and other social media platforms?
I mean, I would always add a little bit of a note of caution there, because I've seen some spectacular egg on your faces in recent years. I think part of the challenge for companies is to understand how CEOs and other high profile figures will manage feedback loops, because there will always be feedback loops. And I think it's also about making sure that there's a filter there, an appropriate filter from somebody in the comms team who has a good understanding of how certain things are likely to land, because that's not always going to be the strength of a CEO. Perhaps they take advice from their sort of younger relatives on how they should be doing that. But I think it's difficult sometimes for them to always be able to get the tone of something absolutely spot on in that sense and minimize risk. But I think in a more general way, for thinking about sharing context without increasing disclosure risk, it can be very useful to have other sort of senior members of the management team communicating with investors, whether that's through sort of investor days or deep dives or site visits or whatever. And the way to manage that, I think, is just to make sure that everyone's had the right level of training so they understand what constitutes color and useful background information, and what might potentially be disclosure, additional market disclosure that is not quite what is needed from them at that point.
Yeah, no, agreed. Thank you. Alex, which formats or channels would you say are working particularly well for engaging with investors directly?
Well, I suppose that has to be company-owned channels. So things like email, social media, website, particularly website, really anything that the company owns is a great way to engage people directly. And also, if we look at the data we have on which channels drive the most new investor engagement, bizarrely, it is not advertising channels. The highest traffic, highest engagement channels that most companies have at the moment are their own social media, their own website, their own disclosures through RNS. And so I think there is a great deal of uncaptured attention that can be found just by using your own channels a bit better.
Andrew?
Well, want to try and sound not too self-interested in my answer here. What we have found is that on-demand audio and short-form content generally works exceptionally well. Gen Z is a growing investor base. Over 86% of Gen Zs, when they're surveyed, talk about how they plan audio and podcasting as part of their daily ritual. In the UK, you've got well over 3 out of 4 people listening to a podcast. So you have a very, very large ecosystem to start off with. I think what's important to understand with this type of content also is we're getting a lot of feedback saying, please don't make me look at something. I want to be multitasking. I don't want to read a long document. I will look at an annual report. I'll pay attention to it, but I really want to concentrate by doing something else at the same time and consuming it by audio. What we've also seen is that with audio, there is a lot of scientific research about what audio does to the brain and how it actually results in a higher retention rate. So your memory recall, your actual concentration is very high. We had a public company client that measured engagement and outcomes through the growth in their audience and through the actual engagement. Most of our clients are seeing hundreds of percentage points in terms of the growth in their audience over time. And the public company I just mentioned, they were seeing their content actually on average consumed 1.4 times. So there was an element of, I actually want to go back and listen to a portion of it a second time. So audio and short form, to me, would be priority channels.
Yeah, good stuff.
Perhaps we should do the next one of these, James, as a podcast.
That'd be fun, wouldn't it? Yeah, I've always wanted to speak into one of those big microphones that you get from podcasting. Sure, there's better reasons to do it on a podcast than giving me that once in a lifetime experience, but there's something worth exploring. Let's move on to proof points. Karen, let me turn to you. How important are proof points in helping the market understand any business, and which proof points would you say matter the most?
I think they're really important because they're the evidence of you delivering on what you say you're going to do. They're the things that provide the facts or evidence of momentum and delivery. And often investors are quite focused on them because they'll be essentially a proxy for performance. It's a high-level read. It's about credibility. It's about demonstrating accountability because there's that link through to remuneration, depending on which ones you're talking about. Essentially, are the shareholders delivering, and what's the sort of quick way of being able to check that? And it will vary. The measures that will vary from company to company, but they should be consistent. They should be relevant. You shouldn't be chopping and changing just to find the things that flatter your story, because that's just confusing, and it means that it's hard to measure progress over time. But I think as a sort of general rule of thumb, the ones that demonstrate scale, growth or lack of, market opportunity, market penetration, and then really importantly, competitive differentiation and strategic progress. Those are the things that are going to help you build that track record of credibility and consistency for investors.
Sure. Thanks, Karen. Andrew, anything to add there?
Very little. I think Karen answered it exceptionally well. I think the only thing I might add is that if you have a relationship with an investor, learn their strategic priorities ahead of time, because then when you do talk about your proof points, you can also deliver the ones that are the most effective because they are already connected to the strategic priorities that the investor may have already shared with you.
No, yeah, understood. Karen, let me turn back to you then. When companies feel there are misconceptions about their business model or investment case, how would you suggest they try and change them?
It's a really interesting one, and it does come up quite often because there can be different reasons why that happens. I mean, sometimes it's because they're just a complex business and they're doing lots of things. They're very diversified. They might have multiple revenue streams. Sometimes it's because they've shifted their business model. They've divested something, they've acquired something, and that can mean that they're going to be re-rated, or they might even be in a completely different sector. And sometimes it's something that's very specific. It might be around, for example, a particular piece of revenue recognition. So I think what's really important is just to understand what people aren't getting. So looking at the questions that you're being asked by investors very frequently, looking at the analyst coverage to understand what's happening. I've seen it happen where one particular analyst has just got the wrong end of the stick about something and has caused quite a lot of chaos for a company because they've ended up really not being very clearly understood. And I think once you understand what the issues are, you can think about how you want to address that. And that can be something really simple, like a page or two in the investor presentation. It might just be a single chart. It might be a little infographic. Sometimes you need a bit more of an explanation around that. So for an investor day, for example, you might be thinking about how you want to deep dive into that. Or sometimes it doesn't even need to be a whole investor day. It might just be a teaching session around some specific aspect of the business. And that can be really helpful as a way of just lifting the bonnet a little bit. And sometimes you need something a little bit more detailed. So we produced, I suppose it was a booklet really for a client last year who they have a particular sort of model of risk and revenue sharing partnerships where essentially the company invests with other engineering companies up front to develop a very expensive bit of kit. It's an engine, but that engine then has a long lifespan. And over the course of that lifespan, it will need lots of ongoing maintenance. So there's a guaranteed revenue stream that flows out of that, but that was not very clearly understood. So a document that explained that, and it was quite a complex process, actually was then really helpful. It just made a point of reference that people could go to and that they could point to, just as a way of just clarifying some of that.
Sure. Thanks, Karen. Andrew, just give you sort of the last word on misconceptions. How can a company address them and change them?
Firstly, I think the thing that's important to do is to avoid behaving defensively. I think it's a common mistake, and companies react rather than going back to the basic fundamentals. What you're really trying to do is tell the story correctly. So tell that right story, be clear, and address whatever misunderstandings you're hearing. Over time, this is not an overnight win, but over time, you will always find that clarity crowds out the noise that you're encountering. So get the story simple, retell it, be clear, and consistent.
Very good. Thank you, Andrew. And Alex, sort of expanding on that, and to give you sort of the last, final opportunity of our question before we move to some questions that come in from the audience. If a company wanted to fundamentally improve how investors understand their business, where would you suggest they start?
Good question. I would start with a very simple litmus test, and I would go and Google your company. Doesn't matter whether you're a small investor or a large investor, the natural reaction that most people have when they are trying to understand something is to Google it, or indeed, to Karen's point earlier, put it into ChatGPT, but go Google the company and see how easy it is to learn about your business. And this actually might go some way to answering the previous question as well. Quite often, the company has all of the right information out there, but it's just not in the right place, or it's not very accessible. And so I would start by just trying to research your own company, because quite often you'd be surprised how difficult it can be to find that information if you're doing it yourself. So maybe just start by trying to research it yourself.
Very good. Thank you very much, Alex. Okay, right, let's move. We've got 12 minutes left. So let's tackle some questions that our audience has kindly submitted. This may well be an opportunity to recap and sort of offer some sort of very concise points. But let me go to Karen and Andrew. I think we've tackled some of this, but what is the best way to communicate your story in the annual reporting process? So one for you, Karen, maybe just recap and your key points.
I think it's about understanding the 5 or 6 things you want to really land as messages, understanding the proof points you need around that, and building a narrative, a proper sort of red thread that connects those things in a way that's meaningful. And just to pick up on something that Andrew and Alex talked about earlier, to think about the context for that story and how you want to set that, because the annual report is a great place to do that slightly more expansive storytelling now.
Yeah. Andrew?
I would really not add much. I think the key is to work with experts like Karen. I think a lot of companies think that they are clear in how they communicate what their company does, how they make money, why they're going to be successful. Sometimes that narrative doesn't come across with the clarity that it should. And it often needs, as Karen said earlier, that independent, objective audit of your messaging that allows the message to then be very impactfully delivered and super clear.
Very good. Thank you, Andrew. Let's tackle one of these questions here. So we've got 10 minutes. Whilst we've been speaking, we had a question come in with a couple of different parts. And I think some of this might have been touched on, but let's just recap and give the person who's asked the question a good, concise answer. Which channels should IR and comms teams focus on to reach investors and potential investors? So let's assume a company is looking to attract new investors. How would they go about doing that, using which tools? And that's a question to anyone who wants to answer it.
Social media. Go on, Alex.
Oh, no, I'll be very concise, so I would say, if I had to pick one, LinkedIn primarily. Fantastic tool. Most investors, retail or institutional, are engaging with it in some way. There is a lot of flexibility in how LinkedIn allows you to advertise, such that you can very cost effectively reach certain groups of people and with great precision. And so it's something that company is probably already using, where you can find the right people quite easily and where you can do it at very minimal cost.
Yeah. Andrew.
Sorry, Andrew.
I would just add, if you equate investor relations to sales, social media and most forms of content creation and distribution do not trigger the sale. They are brand marketing. They are a call to action to make further inquiries, to visit a website, to come most commonly to our website, our PLC, visit us, learn all about us, and then there is an investment decision made. So investor relations, to my mind, is a very clear two-step process of you are effectively generating leads first, so building the interest of new investors, and then there is a call to action, which is make your investment decision. But it's important that you understand it's two clear steps.
Yeah, understood. Okay, if no one's got anything further to add on that, let's go to the next component of this particular question. Where do investors, both retail and institutional, consume news? And how do you therefore devise programs as a listed company to meet where they are? If anybody would like to offer their thoughts on that.
My 30-year-old daughters consume it on social media. They do not go to any news organization to gather their news. And I think that is a common trait for that generation. News is consumed in new platforms compared to 5 years ago. And I think that's very important. The institutional investor, from our experiences in our firm, are also going to less traditional platforms. They're now looking much more at newsletters, at blogs and vlogs. They are looking at alternative expert-driven platforms where they are making their informed decisions from.
Yeah, that's good. That's good, Andrew. Okay, so we got 7 minutes, so no need to rush this one. But let's talk about smaller companies. How would this group suggest that they go about getting the attention of private investors? Alex, maybe that's something you might want to tackle, and then Karen, I suspect you might have some views on that as well.
Yeah, sure. I really love Andrew's framing that investor relations is like sales. I really quite like that. And if we equate then selling your investment case as a smaller company, it's a lot more like startup sales. And startup sales is primarily done through account-based marketing, which is not massively different from what Andrew's saying. And what that means is there is no silver bullet to getting new investors. If anyone tells you, or if you pay to advertise on our platform, they'll see the video and then they'll buy shares, not going to happen. Very unlikely to happen. It is a much longer process. It is much more about the people behind the business. It is much more about the investors forming a relationship with the company and establishing trust. Because if it's a smaller company, it's probably earlier stage, and there are fewer fundamentals and proof points that those investors can rely on. And so I would say, think of it as a broader approach where you need to not just be trying to reach people, but also trying to reach them as frequently as possible and give them a very broad, and again, we're repeating all the things we've talked about in this conversation, context-heavy understanding of business. And I think maybe that's the theme of this discussion. Focus on context, go direct to investors, particularly as a smaller company where there are a lot of small companies in London and in exchanges around the world, and they're all fighting for attention. And so there is a lot more work that needs to go into it than a larger company. And a lot more of it is about, how do I not just reach people for the first time, but how do I get the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh touch point? Because what we know from the world of marketing is that for someone to make any purchasing decision, they generally need to have 7 touch points with a brand or with a product. And when you're a smaller company, you're starting at 0. And so you've got to put a lot more effort into getting to the 7.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think, Karen? Does the annual report play a part?
I'll be honest, a lot of small companies, and you have to be listed to have to publish something that's going to grab anyone's attention. Most potential investors are not rummaging around on company's house to find a kind of black and white Word document, other than if they're at that sort of real, I know about this company, I think I'm interested, I just want to get down and dirty with the numbers type thing. So if it's about, and I agree exactly with what Andrew and Alex said, it's about raising awareness initially, because it's probably a slow process. I think it's probably more about using social media. It's about understanding who you're targeting as investors and where you might find them, because there will be particular forums, there'll be events, there'll be ways in which you can get the best sort of value from your marketing and your investment, your IR spend, by looking at where you're going to find those groups of investors in some form of concentration.
Very good. As a final question, which companies have you seen have done a really great job in all of the things that we've talked about today? Any examples?
Yeah, they're not a client yet, but I think they're a brilliant company. GSK does a very good job at this. We've spoken a lot about frequency of communication, context, meeting people where they are. GSK is a very, very big company, but if you go to their social media or their website, they have an enormous amount of content and context, and a lot of it is not necessarily the CFO or C-suite explaining what they're doing. It is members of the team and the various divisions and country heads explaining things that are happening on the ground. And so if you Google GSK as an investor and try to learn about them, it's very easy. And so I'd say they're a very good example of a company that's adopting a lot of the best practices that we've talked about today.
Thanks, Alex. Does anyone else have anything else they wish to share?
I think I would call out some of the ones that have been award winners for their reporting and their corporate comms over the last sort of few months. So names that spring to mind would be Tesco, SSE, Bunzl, Tate & Lyle, Reckitt, all of whom have been recognized by a sort of independent panel as being best in class for their work.
Good stuff. Many thanks, Karen. And look, that brings us pretty much to the hour. So it remains for me to say thanks so much, all three of you, Andrew, Karen, and Alex, for giving up your time, not just today, to as we run this webinar, but in the planning phases as well. It's been great to hear from you, and I think we've tackled some good points there, and our audience has got some good information it can call upon. if needed. Should anyone that's been watching or is watching this as a recording wants to get in touch with Alex, Andrew, or Karen, their contact details will be available on their marketplace pages. But you can also always come to me, and I'm happy to help make any connection. So to our audience, thank you so much for tuning in to watch us live if you've done so, and if you've watched us as a recording, many thanks for doing that as well. And we look forward to welcoming you back to Spark Insights one day soon, I hope. Thank you and goodbye.
To learn more about how you can capture investor attention and stay top of mind, visit Auddy.com.